Right, hope you're still with us. I know this is quite heavy stuff, really. My presentation will be about how the city affects, or maybe directs, international trade policy. There's growing awareness about international trade agreements, which is great, though really not yet enough focus on where the push for trade agreements is coming from, I think, which is not solely but very much from transnational financial services. So that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at financial services influence on policy, and this is its influence on international trade policy. Which is often not really trade, but trade is very much a convenient and feel-good vehicle for corporate agendas, because everyone knows that trade is an unquestionable good. How could anyone argue with it? Though luckily a lot of people are questioning trade agreements now. So I'm going to just explain some basics about trade agreements, and then I'll say a bit about TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the EU-US Free Trade Agreement, and then talk about the trade lobbying mechanism of the city and my own experience of it. In the language of trade agreements, they are about liberalising trade in goods, that's agricultural manufactured goods, and trade in services. So liberalising to make trade easier and to get rid of what I call trade barriers. The liberalisation of trade in goods is mainly about reducing the tariffs at the border as goods cross borders, so the import taxes. And that has the possibility of making goods cheaper if those savings are passed on. That's the liberalisation of trade in goods. The liberalisation of trade in services is very different. It's about opening to transnational service investors, to letting them into your country and giving them rights. And services, don't forget, includes financial services. So if you're opening to liberalising in financial services, you're opening to banks and all the other financial service products being offered coming in. And the rights are generally about not limiting what they offer. Most of our trade is trade in services. And actually, most aspects of trade in goods. So it's trade in goods liberalisation applies as goods cross borders, and it's about taxes. But actually, all the other aspects of goods, like delivery and labour and credit, these are actually services. So most of what here is being called trade is not really trade as we would generally understand it and expect it. It's more about investment and about corporate rights. So a country can just liberalise unilaterally. So for instance, open a service to transnational investors to get investment in to provide a service. But when liberalisations are trade commitments, when they are part of a trade agreement, they become effectively irreversible. So it's a lock-in mechanism. And trade agreements are promoted by transnational corporations because they are in the interest of transnational corporations. And financial service transnational corporations have a central role in this, and certainly in the EU's trade agreements. So trade in goods and trade in services, along with intellectual property protection like patents, which isn't really free trade at all. It's quite the opposite. It's a restrictive thing. These are the standard components of international trade agreements: trading goods, trading services, and intellectual property protection. So there's already a lot of corporate rights in there anyway, certainly in the trading services and in the intellectual property. But now we've got these bumper so-called trade agreements such as TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, that go much further. And through these, the regulations that frame our society and for the most part protect us from transnational corporations, for instance on chemical and food safety regulations and ideally effective financial service regulations too, these will, with these new breed of trade agreements, these very large trade agreements, the transnational corporations will effectively get to write the regulations, which is a pretty severe change. So with these big trade agreements, a big shift, a very big increase in corporate rights and a big decrease in our democracy, our ability to control corporations, and all irreversible once signed up. And these new trade agreements will also allow transnational corporations to sue governments for any regulatory changes that negatively affect their future profits, either directly or indirectly. So as an example, renationalising railways, that's direct expropriation, and transnational corporations can sue. The introduction of better health regulations on, for instance, obesity foods, booze, smoking, that's indirect expropriation, and they can also sue the government for those. These sorts of cases are held in arbitration courts that are adjudicated by 3 trade lawyers who make a great deal of money, whether they're in that instance judging or at other times appearing for either side, for the corporation or for the state, or whether they're judging. It's all very lucrative work for those. It's a small group of people doing it. And in those circumstances, the judgments are only made on what is most free trade. No other values taken into account, none of the values that we would expect to be taken into account in legal judgments. Notice that I'm talking about transnational corporations because these are international trade deals. Their rights and ability to sue only apply to overseas corporations that have invested into the country or their overseas subsidiaries. So say Barclays and BP, you might assume to be British companies, but in a transatlantic trade deal could utilise these measures via their subsidiaries. But purely domestic companies can't, so it's quite discriminatory in that regard. So it advantages its transnational corporations in every way, despite the rhetoric that's coming out all the time about trade deals being good for small and medium enterprise. So that's all I'll talk about about TTIP. If you want actually more information about TTIP, this booklet's outside that you can get. As I said, financial services are a very big part in all these pressuring for these trade deals. And of course, these corporations are mainly transnational. So how do they affect trade policy? The City UK is the lobbying mechanism for the City of London Corporation. It has a long-established committee on trade called the Liberalisation of Trade in Services Committee, LOTIS. And that's what deals with trade policy here. And then in Brussels, the City UK is a member of the European Services Forum. There's a European Roundtable of Industrialists that has been directing the development of Europe since the early 1980s. But then a European Services Forum was set up at the suggestion of Leon Brittan, a very big figure in international trade, set up to give a particular voice to services and especially financial services. So in Brussels you've got the European Services Forum in which the City UK has a big role, and here you've got the City UK with its LOTIS committee. Then at the global level, there's a global coalition of service industries for WTO level lobbying, and obviously the city's right in there. So same faces, same agendas in London, Brussels, Geneva. The focus on trade agreements is because this is where they get what they want fixed into international trade law, so that when governments change, nothing changes. It's all tied into law. And this is hard law. By comparison, United Nations law is soft law. It just shames countries. But international trade law is hard law because it's backed economically by sanctions, or in the new generation of EU trade agreements, by transnationals able to sue governments. Now, by hook or by crook, mostly by crook, I accessed a Lotus meeting once. And that was a small group of top financial service executives from top banks and insurance companies around an oval table with the chair, who has gone through the revolving door since he had a top job at the Department of Trade and Industry, and two government bureaucrats from UK Trade and Industry. The meeting really consisted of the two bureaucrats being given their orders of what to take as UK input into EU trade policy when they went to the EU trade policy committee meetings. Just to be clear, that is these city financial service executives dictating UK input into EU trade policy directly, bypassing the public and the Parliament. When I went into the meeting, the chair thought that he recognised me, which I incongruously denied. Like if someone says, "Don't I know you?" you don't really say, "No, you don't know me," but that's what I did. But he did know me from many meetings at the Department of Trade and Industry, as it was called then, it's now BIS, where he had a top trade department position before, as I say, before the revolving door and becoming chair of the city's Lotus Committee. That meeting was at the moment when the CETA, the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement, was being initiated, and when the Lisbon Treaty was just coming into force. So at that moment in time, the Lisbon Treaty gave the Commission the power, or the competence in their language, to negotiate investment in trade agreements on behalf of all member states. But the Lisbon Treaty also gave the European Parliament the right to say yes or no to trade deals once they'd been negotiated. So at that point, the people in that room were concerned about the dangers of democracy and what they wanted in the CETA. In the Lisbon Treaty discussion, what emerged was that the chair and some of the others there had visited Europe and Brussels, and who they had visited and who they'd got on side at the European Parliament level, especially in the International Trade Committee of the European Parliament, where they were pretty sure the Tory vice chair from Cambridge was their man. So in that way, they had taken care of democracy. In the CETA discussion, what they wanted included in the trade, they were talking about what they wanted included in the trade agreement and giving the orders to the bureaucrats for what they wanted. Now, I'm aware of quite a secretive part of the trade agenda, which is called Mode 4, which is about moving cheap labour across borders, although it's never called cheap labour. This has a lot of potential to affect workers in the host country, and at least they should know about it. And don't forget that these commitments are effectively permanent. And I clearly remember the arrogant conversation that went on, which was like, and move forward, do we want to move forward? Yes, we'll have move forward in it. That's the way the conversation went. That's how the orders were given. It was like ordering something in a restaurant. It's like ordering an entree or something in a restaurant. And that's how that got into the trade agreement. It was very clear in the meeting who was giving the orders and who was subservient. There is a financial service trade and investment board now, which is overtly the City UK and the UK Trade and Industry Department. But the Lotus Committee still goes on. There's some Freedom of Information notes from Lotus in your pack. Once you're aware of this framework and the trade agreement big picture, you can see, to bring it back to the UK here, how all our domestic legislation has to fit the legislation of the EU, which is itself a building block for the global liberalisation via international trade agreements, that our domestic legislation has to fit within the big picture, and that we have to be a model for that liberalisation as well. The UK liberalises everything, even without trade agreements, as a model for an open economy. You know that phrase that we are the most open economy? This is what it actually means. Because that's what the financial service industry that runs our country and successive UK governments requires. Financial services in TTIP and in other trade agreements. Okay, so there is the financial service part is, actually in the trade agreements. As Tom said, the overall direction being sought via trade agreements, despite the rhetoric about reform of banking, etc., since the crisis, is about ensuring the light touch financial service regulation continues, ensuring that continues. So maintaining the conditions that led to the crisis, where all our money went on bailing out banks, towards austerity policies, and towards a lot of privatisation of public services. So contents of trade agreements are secret until they're completed, but the links of financial chapters show that this is the direction. In your pack there's a paper from the Dutch organisation SOMO explaining in more detail how trade agreements undermine financial service regulation. TTIP and the other agreements are going on right now, other agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and they're all intended to set global rules. So what financial services get out of this, they'll get everywhere. That's what the plan is. So they will affect not just us, but the rest of the world, including developing countries. So you have to come to the conclusion in the end, I think, that the city is our responsibility for the effect on ourselves, but it's our responsibility for the effect on the rest of the world too. Thanks.